Good morning, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's Decarbonization for Development Lab hosted by CSIS Indonesia's lecture titled Great Power Competition and the Politicization of Energy Trade, Implications for Developing Countries. I, Nadia Daulay, am deeply honored to be your host for today's event. In today's lecture, we aim to explore how developing countries can navigate major power dynamics to secure their energy future with Professor Erik Voeten, Peter F. Krogh, Professor of Geopolitics and Global Justice from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Our program this morning is structured into three main parts. We will begin with our opening and welcoming remarks, followed by a distinguished keynote speech. Then we will move into our main DFD lab lecture and conversation, concluding with our closing session. To officially open our agenda today, I would now like to invite Bapak Yose Rizal Damuri, Executive Director of CSIS Indonesia, to the podium to deliver his welcoming remarks. Pak Yose, the floor is yours.
Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and a very good afternoon, a very good morning actually, a very good morning to you all, and welcome actually to the FD Lab lecture, especially for today that would discuss about the great power competitions and the politicizations of energy trade, especially for the implications for developing countries. Again, thank you very much for having your time to be here and then to have these discussions on this very important issue nowadays, especially because this issue has attracted a lot of attention recently. The politicizations of energy trade is no longer something abstract and far in the future, but we already feel it nowadays, especially because of the recent conflict in the Middle East that reminded us that energy security is still closely tied to geopolitics actually. This conflict actually also already shown how quickly a regional crisis that happens far away become a global economic concerns and also regional economic concerns in our regions. The rising tensions around energy routes, particularly the Strait of Hormuz, have disrupted supply and pushed oil price higher, since around a quarter of the world of oil trade passed through Strait of Hormuz. This also already sparked fears over inflation as well as slower global growth. But this recent crisis actually is not a standalone event. It is actually just a tip of the iceberg on what happens, going on at the global level. This is part of a larger transformation in global economic energy landscape, global energy order, where energy trade is no longer shaped only by market logic, supply, demand, and prices, but also increasingly shaped by geopolitical considerations, strategic rivalry, industrial policy, including also weaponizations of a trade policy, what we call weaponizations of trade policy, where countries tend to use trade policy or economic policy as the weapon, as the geoeconomic measures. And it already creates a lot of confusions, but it's also already shift a lot in the energy landscape. Many countries respond to it by having greater investments on energy. For example, IEA projected that global natural gas investments to rise more than 10% to around 330 billion US dollars, mostly because countries as well as companies try to diversify supply risk from the current tensions in the Middle East. But on the other hand, we have also seen increasing investment on renewable energy. This is also good momentum for energy transitions, since it is considered to be more resilient to supply disruptions, most resilience to price fluctuations, because the renewable, most of the renewables actually can be obtained quite cheaper compared to the fossil fuels, and less prone to geopolitical dynamics. Clean energy technology investment actually attracting roughly twice as much as investment as fossil fuels. So we have seen that this really changed a lot in the global energy landscape. However, it's not this kind of shifting, this kind of transition. It doesn't really come with a free it doesn't really problem-free solutions, because it's also creating new forms of competition, especially on the acquirement or accessing the technology, developing the technology, as well as access to critical mineral. The US, for example, we know in 2022 launched the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which include around 350 billion US dollar in incentive for energy security and climate-related programs, including for developing clean manufacturing, batteries, electric vehicles, and many other renewable energy components. Meanwhile, we also have seen that China actually occupied a lot of central positions in many clean energy supplies. When you're talking about, when we want to develop a solar panel, for example, the best options and the cheapest options actually come from China, not from other countries. So this also creates a lot of pressures for critical mineral access and controls, as well as the acquisitions of the technology and the developments of the technology. Demand for critical minerals really increased a lot, because driven by electric vehicle manufacturing, battery storage, renewables, and also grid expansion. For developing countries, since in these lectures we also look at the developing countries, I should also say that for developing countries, this changing landscape presents numerous challenges. On the one hand, for example, many developing countries remain vulnerable to energy shock and supply disruption, as well as lack of access, especially to electricity. But on the other hand, many developing countries are also central to the future of global energy transition, either as those countries who demand more on energy in the future because of their development strategy, or because they play major roles in the supply chains of many critical minerals, such as for Indonesia. We know that Indonesia play very important roles in the nickel supply chains. Many other developing countries also a big source of of these critical mineral supply chains. So our lecture and discussion today, I think, is very important and timely because the politicizations of energy trade, as I mentioned before, it's no longer a distant issue, and it's no longer reserved for developed countries or major power. Developing countries should also have the ability to respond properly, not only to secure their supply of energy, but also to shape the future of the landscape and orders of energy trade. That's why we are very happy today that we have our speaker, especially thank you very much to Professor Erik Voeten from the Georgetown University, who come from all the way from the U.S. and then would deliver the lectures on this very important topic, as well as to Awidya Santikajaya from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who is also a friend of CSIS. Thank you very much, Pak Wit, for coming to our lecture today. So hopefully this lecture will give us a better understanding on the implications of this shifting energy landscape and what options are actually available for developing countries. Thank you very much for your time again, for your participation, and look forward to rich and meaningful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pa Yose, for setting the stage for today's discussions. Distinguished guests, we will now move on to the second part of our program. It is my distinct honor to invite our keynote speaker for this morning. Please welcome Bapak Awidya Santikajaya, the Director of Resources and Industrialization at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Republic of Indonesia, to deliver his keynote address.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good morning. Bapak Jose Rizal, Executive Director of CSIS. Always an honor for me to speak at the CSIS, to refresh my intellectual thinking, and also to escape from my office for several minutes. Now, I'm happy because it is a good opportunity to engage with people from different backgrounds, from different professions, which can enrich our understanding on the side of policymakers. Professor Erik Voeten from Georgetown University, welcome to Jakarta. Glad to have someone from Georgetown. I got my master's degree from Johns Hopkins CSIS, so we compete each other normally. Healthy competition. So, yeah, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my honor to deliver remarks in this important discussion. These remarks, I just write these remarks 10 minutes ago using ChatGPT. So let's see how ChatGPT works in this important event. So energy is not only a source of economic growth, but also a strategic asset that influences national security, foreign policy, and international competition, as well as cooperation. Because energy is so essential, competition for energy resources has long been a driving force in the international relations. Countries compete to secure access to energy resources, control supply chains, and influence global markets. Countries with abundant resources often gain significant economic and political influence, while countries dependent on imports sought to secure stable supplies through diplomacy and partnerships. Historically, energy rivalry focused on access to oil and natural gas. But now the rivalry becomes far more complex. It has evolved from competition over fossil fuel to competition over clean energy technologies, critical minerals, as mentioned by Pak Jose, and the industry that will shape the future of our global economy. If we look at the current global political landscape, there have been profound changes. The United States, for example, has transformed itself from the world's largest oil importer into net exporter of total petroleum products since a couple years ago, I think around 2019, 2020. And recently, US domestic policy has pivoted heavily towards expanding oil and natural gas production at domestic level. China, on the other hand, becomes the world's largest importer of overall energy, crude oil, and gas, LNG. But at the same time, China has established itself as a key leader in advancing the global transition towards clean and renewable energy. How about developing countries? We prefer to call ourselves as middle power, not developing country. This is the term that usually used by many Indonesian diplomats or policymakers. Middle power such as Indonesia, strengthening energy resilience has become an important agenda in responding to evolving global energy challenges. Of course, Indonesia faces energy challenges driven by rapid population growth and expanding economic activity. So for example, our imports of crude oil, for example, is around 360,000 barrels per day. And also we import significant volume of LPG to meet the rising domestic demand, probably around 70%. We currently export LNG, but some studies project Indonesia may turn into net LNG important by 2040. So as the population increases and industrialization expands, of course, pressure on energy supply, infrastructure, and sustainability also grows. For a country as large and diverse as Indonesia, energy fulfillment is strategic necessity. Therefore, strengthening energy resilience is particularly relevant to the current situation. The current war and conflicts in Middle East have resulted in significant disruption to energy production and transportation. President Prabowo Subianto has responded to global energy risks and Middle East-related supply disruptions through some strategic and forward-looking policies. In that context, diplomacy plays an important role to achieve energy self-sufficiency and ensure just and affordable energy transition and energy mix. We are diversifying oil and gas import sources, and in time of uncertainty, of course, it's very important to avoid over-reliance on certain energy sources. So what I can share you, in the short run, we prioritize to secure import of oil and gas from nearby trading hubs, Singapore, Malaysia, as well as from LPG from Australia and some from the US. But we also seriously think of medium and long-term strategy. We look for other resources beyond existing partners. And we know that Pertamina already has some investment and footprints in a number of countries in Africa and Latin America. We want to expand this investment. So we at the MOFA have been working closely with Pertamina, with different ministries and agencies. We formulate strategies to secure energy supplies, expand investment, overseas investments, and also build upstream assets. So we are increasingly looking for Africa and Latin America as part of our diversification strategies. In Africa, our priority targets are, among others, are Angola, Nigeria, and Gabon. A couple of weeks ago, our team and Pertamina sent delegation to Angola to explore investment in oil and gas exploration and production. we are currently in very close and positive discussion, negotiations. Hopefully we can have a good deal with Angola in coming weeks. In Gabon, currently Pertamina operates oil assets that produce around 30,000 barrels per day. And we are seeking larger volumes of crude oil available for shipment from Gabon to Indonesia. And President of Gabon will visit Indonesia later this year. Hopefully we can have a good deal as well with Gabon. With Nigeria, we have just started a discussion for medium and long-term crude oil supply arrangements on top of our existing contracts. So we already have contracts with Nigeria, but we want to expand those contracts to larger volume of oil and gas supply. In Latin America, we are targeting some countries as well: Venezuela, Brazil, Suriname, and Guyana. We are in positive discussions with Venezuela, and of course with the US as well, because geopolitical dynamics there. We would like to ensure that Pertamina subsidiaries there are able to resume lifting Venezuelan crude oil under authorized arrangements. Suriname, this is the new opportunity. We will send delegation to Suriname end of this month. There have been offer from Suriname Staatsolie. We will have a discussion with them in the end of this month. Hopefully, they have a lot of potentials, but not yet exploited by big oil companies. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to emphasize that Indonesia is actively exploring renewable energy opportunities to support the energy transition, strengthen energy security, and achieve its long-term climate and sustainability goals. We are developing, as you know, we are developing large-scale solar, hydropower, and biofuel projects to support future energy demand. Now, I would like to touch a little bit upon issue that might not be discussed extensively in front of public, but we in the government are working intensively in that issue, which is on nuclear energy. So our national energy policy, Kebijakan Energi Nasional, or CAN, has formally recognized nuclear energy not as a last resort, but as a realistic and strategic baseload option to balance energy availability, affordability, and long-term energy supply. The National Electricity Master Plan, RUPTL, set a clear vision for Indonesia to develop up to 7 gigawatt of nuclear energy capacity by 2040, with the first nuclear power plant around 0.5 gigawatt expected to begin operation in 2032 or early 2033. It is imperative for Indonesia to start working on nuclear energy development right now as a strategic decision for the economy. Nuclear energy is not only about electricity, but also about energy security, industrial competitiveness, technological advancement, and high-skill job creation. Nuclear technology is powerful and complex, and no country develops in complete isolation. Therefore, Indonesia works with international partners. The first step of any cooperation with these countries is to work together to conduct feasibility studies to determine whether nuclear project is realistic, safe, and economically viable. As you know, in many news that some countries, not many countries, very targeted, very selected countries approach Indonesia to have cooperation on nuclear energy. And I would like to use this opportunity to highlight that Indonesia wants to have international cooperation on nuclear energy that support the development of a domestic nuclear ecosystem. So we are not just, buying the electricity, but we want to have technology and knowledge transfer, human capital development, as well as the development of local supply chains, manufacturing capabilities, non-power application of nuclear technologies. So we put emphasis on the importance of the ecosystem. Another important highlight is that Indonesia adopts an inclusive approach to nuclear energy cooperation. Our priority right now is to achieve 0.5 gigawatt of nuclear energy target by 2032. But we also have larger target, which is 7 gigawatt of electricity generated from nuclear power plants by 2040. That means if we choose certain technology for the 0.5 gigawatt by 2032, we still have the remaining 6.5 gigawatt to be offered to different partners, different technology vendors. So we are inclusive. We are working with selected countries, but of course, this is not only technical, but also a lot of geopolitical dimension that we have to consider. So indeed for Indonesia, inclusivity, holistic approach, and long-term oriented policy are core principles guiding Indonesia's energy security strategy. This is, I think, the key message that we in the government consistently advocate for. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that today's lecture by Professor Erik Voeten will foster our understanding, knowledge, and informed dialogue about energy issues in the midst of global geopolitical dynamics that will eventually enrich Indonesia's decision-making on energy policy and development. As countries navigate growing energy demand, it is essential that we have inclusive and constructive dialogue with different stakeholders and share a common understanding on how to address energy challenges. In that context, I would like to express a sincere appreciation to CSIS for providing a platform to discuss complex energy issues in an open and accessible manner, helping bridge the gap between policy, research, and public understanding. With that, I wish you all a productive and enriching session. Thank you very much, and thank you, ChatGPT. Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Pak Awidya, for the insightful keynote address. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now arrived at the main feature of today's event, the DFD Lab Lecture and In Conversation session, focusing on our theme, Great Power Competition and the Politicization of Energy Trade Implications for Developing Countries. To lead the session, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Mas Andrew Mantong, Senior Researcher at the Department of International Relations, CSIS Indonesia. Mas Andrew will be in conversation with our esteemed guest lecturer, Professor Erik Voeten, the Peter F. Krogh Professor of Geopolitics and Global Justice from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. I invite you both onto the stage, and I will hand the floor over to Mas Andrew to moderate this session. Please.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for giving me a chance to be the moderator for today's session. Actually, I have to mention that earlier when we met in the foyer, I have a kind of fanboying moment because I've been reading works of Professor Erik Voeten as a student of international relations quite a lot. He's been the editor of a very top-tier international relations journal, international organization. I think you're still part of the board of editorial, right? Yes. Professor Erik Voeten is from Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, where he holds the Peter F. Krogh Chair in Geopolitics and Global Justice, a title that I think you'll agree by the end of this session he is clearly earned. So Professor Erik is one of the most cited scholars in international relations today, as I mentioned earlier, And he's also the author of Ideology and International Institutions, published by Princeton University Press. For today's discussion in CSIS, this has been very timely topic. We just finished our series of research that we are trying to do since 3 years ago about how Indonesia should adopt the rising discourse of economic security. We still believe that Indonesia is still struggling to embed the sort of logic of open economy and market economies in our economic system as well as political system. So we've been trying so hard to find the sort of concept that can work amidst the rising discourse of economic security. So we've been talking about, for example, 2 years ago, how Indonesia is dependent over several commodities, and energy is actually one of our concentration. And I believe that, as Yose mentioned earlier, that there have been some, some dilemma for Indonesia for the policy future. Because in one of our research, we identified that Indonesia is somewhat diversified today because we have a different set of supplier in terms of crude oils and refined oils. We do have problems of refinery choke points, which is proven kind of urgent given the crisis that we have in Hormuz Strait. But in terms of crude oil, we still have, like for example, Pa Awid mentioned, we still have alternative coming from Africa, and now increasingly it's coming from Latin America. But in the study, we sort of identify that if Indonesia wants to move away from this kind of dependencies, the alternative energy, the renewable energy is actually one of the pathway forward. But the immediate question is actually the fact that China is already dominating that particular realm. So we've been entering into the world where US is increasingly talking about fossil fuels again, and China is somewhat dominating the sort of renewable energy. So I believe this topic is going to be much more elaborated by Professor Erik Voeten. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Erik Voeten.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much for hosting me here at CSIS, and thanks so much for the generous introductions and for the interesting remarks. I was very interested to learn about nuclear strategy in Indonesia. I did not know anything about that. I should also say that I'm a scholar of international relations. This is my second time in Indonesia. I'm here to learn a lot about Indonesia. I'm learning more and more every single day, but I don't know the ins and outs. I'm mostly thinking about how the global political landscape affects countries, including Indonesia, in their access to energy. And so I'm delighted, I'll try to keep it short. I'm delighted to have a discussion and to also field questions over these topics. So as people already pointed out, there have been two really big changes in great power politics and the supply of energy around the world. The one in the United States is what we call the shale revolution. And I don't think everyone has appreciated sort of how big a change this has been for the US economy, but also for US politics. So the red line here is total petroleum imports by the United States, and the blue line is exports. So the US has always been an oil country. They've always had oil production, but they were also the world's largest oil importer for like 50 years or so. That started to change in the mid-2000s due to technological developments, basically hydrological winning of oil and gas, that really massively increased US production. And by 2018, the US became a net exporter. They're still importing a lot. That partially has to do with refinery infrastructure, as you already mentioned. That's very important in the United States as well. So some refineries are built for certain types of oil. So you import those types of oil, you export other types of oil, but they've become a net exporter. And that's massively important for US foreign policy because for so long, a lot of US foreign policy was centered on the Middle East, securing oil supplies, and that is now changing quite rapidly. And at the same time, we've had China becoming dominant in green energy. So people have mentioned solar already. 90% of solar modules are being produced by China. 90%. That's a lot. That's real dominance of the market. And Chinese solar cells are cheaper, more efficient, more effective than the solar cells produced elsewhere. The bigger change, I think, in recent years has been in battery cells. That is driving, of course, electric vehicles, but much more broadly, the production of batteries that are increasingly being used as a general purpose technology. So because batteries have improved so much in efficiency, we're seeing all kinds of new applications of batteries. So not just in electric vehicles, but also for the electric grid, for example. So you can use solar and then you can have storage in massive batteries. China dominates that sector. 83%. The batteries produced by China are the most technologically advanced, and they're cheaper than batteries produced by other countries. And you go down the list, sort of wind turbines, critical mineral refining, electric vehicles, China is really dominant. So as a scholar of international relations, what I'm asking is, so we have also increased tensions between the US and China over other issues, over geopolitical dominance, because China has been growing, the US has been concerned about this and their geopolitical conflicts. So, what do these two trends mean in the context of rising conflict between these two big superpowers? And does that then politicize what energy you can access? So, of course, for most countries, you would want the energy that does the job, right? And that's complicated, and I'm happy to explain more about the various complications in getting energy access, but you want energy that meets the demand at a reasonable cost, and that's also reliably there, that you can count on to be there. That's what energy security really means. But does that sort of growing geopolitical competition, does that complicate those types of strategies? So how does having competing great powers in different energy domains affect international cooperation? Does it affect fragmentation and energy trade? And then especially, how does it affect developing energy importers or middle power energy importers? I'm happy to use that term as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through 4 different ways in which this can affect countries. Then I'm going to end with a very brief empirical discussion, but I'll just leave it up mostly for discussion. So the 4 ways are, first of all, how it changes what we call the domestic political economy. So I'm a scholar of international relations, but these days in international relations, we think that much of what countries do in foreign policy is driven by domestic politics. And that's certainly true in the United States, that's true in Indonesia, it's also true in China. So energy, these energy markets have transformed the domestic political economy of China and the US, and I want to think about the foreign policy implications of that. Then using energy as a weapon, we see that in the news every day, the Strait of Hormuz, so I don't have to explain that so much. The third one I think is more complicated, sort of changes for overall cooperation, and then the question of political realignment along energy lines. That is, are electrostates, or states that want to become more dependent on green energy, are they also starting to cooperate in other issues, and so on. All right, so let me start with the first. So George W. Bush, right, who was a Republican and the President of the United States from 2001 to 2008, identified sort of in 2006 America's addiction to oil as a problem. Right? In this stage, 2006, the US was still by far the largest oil importer. And at that point, he said, what we need to do is technological breakthroughs through green energy. And he announced a big investments in green technology in the United States in 2006. I'm starting with this because now, of course, you know we have President Donald Trump in 2016. He came to power. The first day in office, he abandons the Paris Agreement, right? That hasn't always been political conflict like that, right? Even in 2006, the Republican president before Donald Trump was saying we need to embrace green energy in order to break our addiction to oil. So what happened in between is that, that shale revolution. So before the US was import dependent, now they're not anymore. And the production in the US is very geographically concentrated. It's concentrated in a handful of states that are all solidly Republican states. They didn't all used to be. For example, West Virginia is a good example. Used to be a Democratic state in the United States. Now it's Republican, very strongly. And Ohio is another example of a state that used to be Democratic or leaning or swing state, and now it's solidly Republican. And so energy has all of a sudden become polarized. Energy is not always polarized. It's not natural to think of energy as a polarizing topic, but it has become polarized in the United States. So in the 2024 cycle, 90% of donations from the oil and gas industry went to Republicans. That's very unusual. Typically in lobbying and so on, business gives to both sides, right? Because they want to win regardless of who wins in office. So they want to stay on the good side. But in this case, no, it's very strongly partisan. And that means that you get very large policy swings across administrations. So mention was made of the Inflation Reduction Act that was adopted by the Biden administration, which was supposed to increase investment into green energy in the United States, but that act has now been dismantled by the Republicans. And of course that's hard because energy investments, you make energy investments 20, 30 years down the road, right? You're just thinking, okay, we want nuclear energy by 2030, 2035, because it takes a long time to make these investments count. So if you get big policy swings every 4 years, that makes it very difficult to have big changes in your energy output. The shale boom in the United States also really undermined the investment in research and development. So when George W. Bush said in 2006, we really need to invest in technology because we're addicted to oil, that made sense in 2006, but then energy became really cheap in the United States. And so no businesses want to invest anymore in green technology because gas is cheap, natural gas and also gasoline for cars is cheap. And so the incentives for technological breakthroughs and R&D disappeared. That is, of course, very different in China, which doesn't have a lot of domestic oil, and you saw massive investments in research and developments in China. And now you get ideological opposition to green energy. The Trump administration is actually handing out $1 billion to a wind farm to stop it from producing wind, right? It makes no sense at all. Most people in the energy world believe the US should take an approach where you're just sort of thinking whatever energy you can get, whether it's renewable energy, nuclear energy, fossil fuels. You don't have to be ideological about it because in the US we also now have expanding energy demand thanks to ChatGPT, right? Like all the data centers that need to be fueled, which is a new thing. In the US for 20 years we had constant energy demand and now all of a sudden there's increased demand, but we're saying we can't have wind turbines because wind turbines are bad. That's very political. That's not sort of rational policy making that is happening in the US. By contrast, in China, the kind of green energy development is a product of decades of deliberate industrial policy. Right, this started in the 1980s already with critical minerals, and then 90s and 2000s, so it's a very different story. By now, the green energy sectors are 1/3 of GDP growth in China, so it's becoming a really big source of economic development. $200 billion in green tech exports just in 2025. So it's a clear, credible planned strategy. It is, of course, it comes out of weakness as well because China is very susceptible to oil price volatility. China, even though it's very dominant in green energy, is also the world's largest oil and gas importer. right? And those things go hand in hand. It needs a lot of oil and gas, and it produces a lot of green technology. And they might be sort of independent by 2065. It takes a long time to get there. And so the key contrasts here are that US energy policy is really polarized and volatile, and China's energy policy is very strategic and consistent. But the US doesn't really depend on others, right? The US is very self-sufficient, whereas China is very dependent on imports of oil and gas, but it's also very dependent on trade rules by other countries, because the green energy that it's exporting is manufactured goods, and countries have tariffs on manufactured goods. Countries don't have tariffs on oil and gas imports, right? So the US can just export its oil and gas. It doesn't have to worry about trade rules. China has to worry a lot about tariff policies from other countries. So those are changes. All right, so that's the domestic political economy. So now sort of the oil weapon. So traditionally, oil as a weapon, the sort of discussions about this really stem from the 1970s, right? When Arab states started to use oil embargoes against the United States and some European countries, and they wanted concessions on Israel policy. And the reason why people always think that oil could potentially be used as a political weapon is because countries depend on a consistent flow of oil and gas. So you can have strategic reserves that may last you for a few months, but ultimately you need continued supply of oil and gas. And that means countries are often very vulnerable and very sensitive to any kind of blockage, as we're now seeing in the Strait of Hormuz. Many developed countries have about 90 days of reserves. Developing countries typically have less. So we're testing the limits of that kind of vulnerability right now. And then there are choke points. So choke points are specific points of failure that could block that continued supply, the continued flow. So the Strait of Hormuz is an example. In Europe, of course, pipelines, cutting off of natural gas from Russia to Germany. And so for a long time, sort of since the 1970s, people sort of said, well, this oil as a weapon, it didn't work in the 70s. There's a reason it didn't work. And it kind of disappeared, that concern. Because energy, especially oil and gas, started to be traded on global markets against global market prices without countries really having to worry that all of a sudden the supply would be cut off. From sort of the 1980s to about 2022, there wasn't much concern about energy use as a weapon. And the US can't really use its oil production so much as a weapon per se because it doesn't dominate the global market, right? It has only a pretty small share of the global market. What the US has is that security and financial power. So part of the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz is also the US saying ships can't go into Iran right now. And the US has the world's largest naval power that can project that power there. And the US also has financial power where it can say, if you're a tanker, for example, you can no longer get oil from Iran, otherwise we'll deny you access to the US banking system or to a refinery, right? That's financial power. And that weaponization we see the US use a lot, and it kind of makes the US what we call a unilateral sanction power. The US can actually impose sanctions on the rest of the world because it controls so much access to the banking system. And that's really how the US is shaping control over energy, much less through actually the supply of oil, much more through finance. The US has also become more likely to impose sanctions on oil producers. So when the US was the world's major oil importer, it didn't like imposing sanctions on oil producers. Now, Iran, Russia, of course, are good examples. But there are other sanctions as well. It regularly sanctions oil producers and then imposes those sanctions on the rest of the world, right? So it says that if you do business with Iran as a refinery, you'll get denied access to the US banking system. And that is a big threat. It's especially a big threat for the larger refineries, including in China and elsewhere. The smaller operations don't necessarily need the access to the US banking system, but the larger operations do. And it means that oil from Russia and from Iran and other sanctioned countries is traded at below market prices. So if you're willing to endure the cost of US sanctions, you can buy oil at a cheaper rate. And that makes it very political, right? Because only countries and refineries in countries that are not aligned with the US are willing to go against US sanctions. And so they get cheaper oil and gas from Russia and from Iran, but it becomes also a very political exercise. So for green energy, the mechanism is different. So China really dominates much more of the market in green energy than the US dominates the market in oil. So 90% of solar batteries, the US does not have that kind of dominance in oil and gas. And Senator Joe Manchin, I should explain this, he's famous in the United States, maybe not famous in Indonesia, but he was the Democratic senator from West Virginia, and he was often like the last senator everybody needed to get support for approvals. He was we call the pivotal senator in the US. And he said, like, I can remember waiting in line at the gas station in 1974. I don't want to intend to wait in line for a battery produced in China. Right, so that's the idea that if you become, more dependent on battery technology, you also become more dependent on China. But of course, there is a difference between oil and gas and batteries because it's not a continued flow vulnerability. So you buy solar panels, you buy the ability to produce electricity for the next 30 years. Right? You buy oil and gas, you consume it in the next month. So it's a different kind of dependence that exists. So you can't really use it as a weapon in the same way. The exception, of course, are critical minerals, and I'm sure you've all read this in the news, so I'm going to skip over this. So rare earth minerals. The one thing I would say, I think this is also a pretty limited weapon. Like China can't really use this in the long run because it needs to sell the products based on these rare earth minerals to the world, right? And it's also vulnerable to counter sanctions. So it's something China can use in trade negotiations, but it's not really something they can use in the long run as a strategy to really get political concessions. And what really drives China's dominance is refining capacity, not geology. Now, the other difference between green energy dependence and oil and gas dependence is that a lot of oil and gas production is driven by geology, whereas the production of green energy is driven by technology and manufacturing capacity, which means that you could potentially overcome this dependence. So in here, I think for Indonesia, I'm very excited. Next week, I'm going to visit the Hyundai electric vehicle facility here in Cikarang, I believe. Because Indonesia has all the ingredients to potentially become a player, right? I think you have to import lithium, but otherwise you actually have everything here to produce electric vehicles, to produce batteries. And potentially you can set up alternative supply chains. It's not geological dependence, it's dependent on developing strategies for manufacturing and setting up supply chains and so on. So that means it can change in a way more quickly than oil and gas supplies can. So that's a big difference. Now, all right, so what about the broader cooperation incentives? Here I think this is one of the biggest changes. So the big change in the 1970s was this so-called oil for security bargain. You may also have heard of the term petrodollars. That comes from the 1970s. That's the idea that basically the US and Saudi Arabia and other main producers sat around the table, and the US said, we're going to provide security for you, stable sort of security for the flow of oil and gas. And one thing that we then want from you is that you sell all the oil and gas in dollars, right? That helps make the dollar the dominant currency in the world, because almost all the trade in oil and gas is administered in dollars, and that makes the dollar, or helps make the dollar a reserve currency. But it also meant that oil was sort of traded in what people called one great pool. You don't have to have contracts per se, you don't need to do bilateral deals. So I thought this was very interesting when we heard from the foreign ministry that they're now negotiating specific deals with countries for the supply for oil. But before 2022, you didn't have to do that. You just buy oil on the global market, and you don't care where it comes from, really. I mean, you care what grade it is, but you don't really have to do a bilateral deal with Venezuela to get oil. You just buy it on the global market. That has really changed. And one reason I think why this has changed is really because the shale revolution eroded the incentives for the US to provide what we call global public goods. And the global public good here is like the stability of the Strait of Hormuz, the stability of trade and so on. And we're seeing this everywhere. And we saw this before the recent conflict. We see that the US has weakened sort of security relationships. They've weakened in investments in specific assets that they have to supply these public goods, like the Navy, and the US doesn't depend this on anymore. And you're seeing this as well in quotes from the Trump administration, even before the Iran war. So that we don't get any, so this is from 2025, we don't get oil anymore from the Strait of Hormuz. And so when you're in a position, when military power, you can actually have now the courage to use that. And I've talked about this with a lot of people that were inside administrations. If you had proposed to do a military attack on Iran 10, 15 years ago, people would be screaming, saying no, because we need the oil from the Strait of Hormuz, and gas prices in the US would go through the roof. But now you don't get the same kind of concerns in the United States. The costs are mostly borne by other people, right? Other places in the world. And the US itself is less concerned with this. Energy secretary as well. Like we have, so the energy, this energy secretary right now says we don't have to worry about a crazy spike in oil prices, and that gives the president more leverage in geopolitics. And more leverage basically means fewer constraints, right? Fewer constraints on what the US can and cannot do, because when the US is doing something to destabilize the Middle East, the president doesn't have 10 people screaming at him saying, no, you can't do that because of oil prices. It's more a removal of a constraint. And this was there was this famous leaked signal chat where administration officials had accidentally added a journalist on a secret chat, and they said like, well, we don't have to worry about Suez Canal. 40% of European trade runs there, but none of our trade runs there, right? So we don't really have to worry about this anymore. Again, this would be inconceivable even like 10 years before this, that an American vice president would say this. And so I think this is really a problem. It also undermines reciprocity for what I mentioned earlier. I go a lot to Europe. The Europeans really feel this, right? They were cut off from Russian oil and gas. Now they want LNG from the United States. They're not going to impose tariffs on LNG or oil or so on that they're imposing from the United States because it's already so expensive in Europe. And so now the US says, we're going to impose tariffs on you. And normally, when we're doing trades, we have this principle called reciprocity, right? We're saying, I'm not going to tariff your goods, and you're not going to tariff my goods. But now there's an imbalance, right? Because the Europeans are not, mostly what the Americans export to Europe is petroleum products. The Europeans are not going to put tariffs on there, so they're much weaker in their bargaining position. And it gives the US an incentive to be much more aggressive in demanding concessions. So I wrote a piece on this in Foreign Affairs with Michael Ross. That's a long quote. I'm not going to read it. You can look it up if you want. But we wrote about this in the spring of 2025. Where basically said like, this gives the U.S. incentives to do things that look good in the short run, but in the long run undermine the stability of the international system, and that may actually come to hurt the United States itself in the long run. Because the US, I think, ultimately fares well with a more stable system. Now, China is, of course, the world's largest crude oil exporter, and they're trying to diversify through all kinds of things, strategic reserves. They have huge overcapacity in coal. They have pipeline deals with Russia through Siberia, so they're trying to diversify as well. But they're still very dependent on this. But they want to achieve energy independence. And the one thing I want people to think about, what energy independence for China might mean, because the same logic applies there, right? If China is no longer dependent on importing oil and gas, when they think about something like, say, Taiwan, now they're worried about oil and gas sanctions, the US ability perhaps to cut off oil supplies by blocking sort of transport, or by denying access to financial systems. But that wouldn't be the case anymore if China achieves de facto energy independence. So we always think of energy independence as like a great goal to achieve, but energy independence among great powers can be really destabilizing because it removes some of the incentives for cooperation. It gives them some more freedom to act, and freedom to act is not always good, especially not for countries that have very powerful militaries and that are very powerful geopolitical actors. So I don't think this is US specific. It's just that China isn't there yet. So China has some way to go before the green energy revolution is there. But definitely this is the objective, to get energy independence. All right. Then finally, and I'll keep this short, so one of the questions that people have now is sort of, in this new politicization, are we going to see new coalitions between what people are calling petrostates, like the US and Russia, and electrostates? So the European Union, for example, and China. Indonesia is, of course, in the middle. Indonesia used to be a large oil producer. It still produces oil, and it still has domestic coal as well, but I think also increasing demand for electricity. I think there's no evidence for this. There's some people who say that there is, but I don't really believe it. So yes, so China and the EU share interest in decarbonization and clean energy. And so, for example, in the Paris Agreement or global climate negotiations, they'll often take similar positions, right? And you see the US and Russia taking also similar positions in climate negotiations. But shared energy needs do not necessarily create shared interest. I think that, why is that? Well, basically fossil fuel lock-in. Now, the EU still is very dependent. All these sort of so-called electrostates are still super dependent on oil and gas, and that you need immediately, so there's no real way of sort of politicizing this. It's not to your advantage. Then there's a lot of competitiveness concerns. So even states that share China's emphasis on decarbonization, they're worried about China's market dominance, right? Because they worry that this is going to undermine their own industries. And you see this in Europe. I think you see this in Indonesia as well, right? Where, yes, it's great. We want to electrify. We need to electrify on transport. It would be useful. But if all of that is going to just mean Chinese-produced electric vehicles, you'd like to have some domestic production here as well. And you're going to try to sort of structure deals in order to achieve that. So yes, you get shared interest, but you also get competition. And then, security is still dominant. So the security ties are still, I think, more important for among great powers. Finally, sort of interdependence also comes in a lot of different forms. So I don't think we're seeing this kind of realignment. What I do think we're seeing, and I'm just going to go through this really quickly because I want to get just to the conversation, is a much more politicization of energy trade. And I've already found this in the data, where basically what we're seeing with fossil fuels, trade is being politicized partially because of US sanctions. And what we're seeing is that importers that are not that dependent on the US for security are increasingly buying from Russia and Iran at lower prices. And that means, and increasingly are structuring these kinds of bilateral deals with countries, right? And we're seeing this so increasing politicization of fossil fuel trade. In green energy, we're seeing this fossil fuel trade politicizing, but it's driven by a different dimension. That is that countries that are concerned about competitiveness, but that are also geopolitically in conflict with China, are increasingly imposing trade restrictions on green energy trade with China. So in Europe, for example, they're just passing another package where you have tariffs on Chinese solar cells, batteries, electric vehicles, but also restrictions on Chinese FDI going into Europe for green energy projects. At the same time that Europe says we need to decarbonize and we need to increase investment in green energy, right? So the two goals can go hand in hand. They're saying we don't want to rely on China, and yes, we want to decarbonize. And that means that sort of that the trade in green energy becomes more political as well. It means that this is driven no longer purely by market logic, which is you buy the best products at the cheapest prices, but you buy also from who you are aligned with politically. And that is now true in both fossil fuels and it's true in green energy trade. So increasingly for your energy strategy, as the spokesperson from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said, it depends now on making deals with countries you have good relationships with. And not just on just buying on an open market. And that's really changing energy trade. I can send people the paper if you want. There's some pretty graphs that I'm just going to go through because I think I'm running out of time. And I wanted to end with the implications for developing countries. And here, I'm sure that's where we start the discussion as well. So clearly, South and Southeast Asia are driving much of the growth in global energy use. That's driven, of course, by large cities. I know Jakarta is now officially, according to the UN, the largest city in the world. But you're seeing massive expansion and demand for air conditioning and all kinds of other things that come with economic growth. Most countries in South and Southeast Asia are importers, so you are very exposed to oil and gas price shocks that are more amplified now. Of course, for Indonesia, one major issue is the fossil fuel subsidies that are very large and that are really putting a lot of pressure on the government budget right now. But it's really interesting to see the different impact in Indonesia than in, for example, Thailand and the Philippines, where there is pass-through to consumers. In Indonesia, we haven't seen that yet to the same degree. But it's going to be very difficult, I think, for the government to maintain those subsidies among this much pressure. And then you do have some freedom to buy sanctioned oil, but then you get in trouble with the United States. And that is also very difficult. And I don't know how Indonesia comes down on this. I haven't seen much evidence of large, so it's mostly China and India that have purchased large amount of Russian and Iranian oil. But that's an option here as well. And then, of course, as I already mentioned, the cheapest path to clean power runs through China, which is fast and affordable. But it raises other kinds of issues of dependence. So that is a hard thing. And then finally, there's just limits to the green transition as well. Sort of not everything can be electrified, and not everything can be electrified quickly. It'd be great if those new big nickel smelting power plants, you could electrify them, but you can't do it, right? I think in Indonesia, or especially for Jakarta, transport would be one sector where I think the benefits are enormous because you also reduce air pollution, which is a major issue here. And that's also where fossil fuel subsidies are really important. But it's going to take a really long time. And that's true for any kind of energy policy. You're talking about policies that are going to take effect over decades. And politics, politicians don't always think 20, 30 years ahead. Our politicians think about the next election. That is true in the United States, it's true in Indonesia, it's true in most countries, and it's a little bit less true in China. And this is really why I think China has had more success with it. This is kind of a sector where planning really works. And it's harder to do in countries where you have to make large upfront investments and the benefits aren't going to materialize until your successor is in power. That's not popular in politics. So I'll end there, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Professor Erik Voeten, for such a wonderful presentation. I believe we have learned a lot, and for the first part of the discussion, I would like to use my prerogative rights as a moderator by asking you that we're entering to 2026 now, and you mentioned already there have been some political alignment along with energy lines in the United States, but in the same year, we've been also witnessing some of the significant phenomena in U.S. foreign economic policies, like for example on tariff escalation in 2025, which Indonesia is also part of the dynamics. And would you expect that the green energy alignment effect among U.S. allies to accelerate? For example, given the fact that some European countries signal interest already in cheaper Chinese solar, does it cause something in the U.S. because of these various, various policies? So the energy policy is not standing alone. You have also another instrument of U.S. Foreign economic policies, and given this kind of dynamics, there have been new, action, like for example, signaling interest in Europe for Chinese cheap Chinese solar. Does it mean something for U.S. political life now?
Thank you very much for that question. So in Europe, in Europe Europe is also in a very difficult position because Europe doesn't have a lot of fossil fuels, and Europe is also very committed to climate goals, and so they want to decarbonize, and they want to decarbonize quickly. They're also seeing right now that with the price increases are very high in Europe, like they are in much of Southeast Asia. But the countries where the price increases are less are the countries that have the most clean energy. So in Spain, electricity prices now are 5 times lower than in Italy. And Spain has a lot of solar, Italy doesn't, right? So clearly that makes everybody think we should have more solar power, more renewables. But then they're also thinking if we do that, then we switch our dependence on China. And so ideally, they're also, like every country in the world right now, and this is a political moment, is passing industrial policies that are basically made in Europe, made in Indonesia, made in the United States. And Europe was very reluctant to do that. Europe is one of the last sort of areas because Europe was always like the single market, the World Trade Organization, but now they're passing all these made in EU laws. And the US, of course, started that. Like also the Inflation Reduction Act was very much about made in the US. And you just see this everywhere. So in the US, this is, this is the political moment. I think the Democrats have also, so both Democrats and Republicans are actually using industrial policy, and they're using Made in America provisions. So as I mentioned, the Inflation Reduction Act also has that. And I think it's a broader geopolitical moment. You see this everywhere. I think you see this in Indonesia. You see this almost all over the world, where countries are putting a lot more emphasis on having products produced in their country. And that is, of course, inefficient, right? Everyone who's taken a basic trade course knows that you benefit from the gains from trade, comparative advantage, and that these types of policies make the energy transition slower, more expensive, and also reduce global economic growth.
Okay, since we're talking about Europe here, and in your presentation you mentioned that in the past there have been the old bargain of the oil for kind of security bargain, and we noted from your presentation that U.S. is actually leveraging the energy abundance in foreign policy, but this also comes with the fact that it can create a new dependencies, like the European Union. The Europeans now need U.S. LNG, and it can give some sort of concentration over what U.S. can export in the global market. So this condition alone, there have been some complication between, transatlantic relations has always been complicated since War on Terror, I believe. But given this fact of new potential of dependencies and different pathways of energy, does this can create, what you mentioned in your presentation as the old bargain? Or is it like structurally different because this is purely commercial, not strategic, and so on and so forth? What's your take?
Yeah, so I was just in Brussels and I was visiting the NATO and the European Commission, and it definitely creates new tensions. And I don't know, so you mean like a bargain between, also with China or so?
I mean between US and European Union, so does it create another, dependencies over energy, and then energy could be used for security kind of binding?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So when Europe cut off the pipeline gas from Russia, and they immediately turned to the United States, and the United States started building terminals to export LNG. Now, economically, that was difficult for Europe because LNG is more expensive than pipeline gas. But immediately, the Europeans realized, now we replace dependence on Russia with dependence on the United States. So the word that everybody uses in Europe is strategic autonomy. And strategic autonomy means strategic autonomy in terms of energy and security It also means strategic autonomy in terms of artificial intelligence, AI. And everybody's trying to figure out, so everybody says that, right? Like we want autonomy, we want sovereign AI, we want to make sure our own security is guaranteed, we want our own energy. The problem is how you get there. And it's like a great goal, and again, I think this is a political moment, because we had a period in the world where most countries were not that concerned about this, because you have a well-functioning international trade system. And if you have that, then you're less concerned about autonomy, because you have access to arms and energy on a global market. And now that that global market is not working as well, or is more politicized, everywhere around the world you see those kinds of initiatives of saying like, no, we need to be self-sufficient. And then the question for policymakers is, how do you do this, right? Because the US makes all the arms, the Chinese make all the solar panels, the US, Silicon Valley makes all the artificial intelligence. The Europeans don't make artificial intelligence. I mean, the Chinese do as well. So it's a very difficult situation. And I'm sure for Indonesia, that's true too.
Yeah, we just also came back from our visits to some of the middle power countries. So we've been hearing about this, strategic autonomy kind of thinking shared by countries like Indonesia, France, Germany, Canada. But the question is always how. Yeah. That's a good political ethics now, increasingly occurred between countries concerned about increasing pressures from great powers. But the problem is how, because I think at least from the military sides, whatever choice you decide on which technical military choice you're going to pursue, that comes with alignment cost. So are we in that also condition when it comes to energy? So I know that you mentioned that there have been some potentially realignment of how the choices that states is making over who they are trading with in terms of energy can create a political alignment. So is it the same between energy and military, that some of the technical choices you make is not neutral anymore?
Yeah, I think that is right. I think that is correct. So so like in the military, Indonesia also buys a lot of arms from the United States. If you buy F-35s from the United States, you can't just switch to other kinds of planes, because you have to retrain your pilots, you have to maintenance contracts, all these things. And the same is of course true in energy, right? You have a refinery can produce only certain kinds of oil. If you switch to more electric vehicles, then you have to build up a whole infrastructure that facilitates that. If you electrify your economy, you have to build a grid. So you're buying into infrastructure for really long periods of time, and that can create a dependence as well. So in that sense, I think there are some similarities there.
Okay. Before I throw the opportunities to the floor, I would like to ask one particular question concerning about us in Indonesia. So we've been always put in some kind of dilemmatic positions about choosing our continuous dependence over fossil fuels and our aspirations to become a more clean energy kind of state. But we've been talking about these power, security, alignment consequences of the energy competition between US and China. But between countries categorized as middle power, there have also been another problems. So we've been talking about European Unions, and we've been talking about a general organization like ASEAN. But the experience that Indonesia is having with countries like European, so we've been thinking about exploring, for example, if you visit Hyundai later tomorrow, we've been talking about moving up the ladder of EV batteries, like from refineries to recycles. And we want to explore the European market for that. But the problem is also standards. Yeah. That sometimes for us, the standards is too high. So they also apply in Indonesia, the dilemma of great power rivalry sometimes boil down to the questions whether these new environmental ESG standards is actually kind of dictating for us. So since we are talking about standards, we are talking about the consequences of international organization, right? Creating rules, norms, and so on and so forth. So we've been talking about potential realignment of energy, but what about the international institutions? What about the sort of global needs to eschew what's have already illustrated in Game of Thrones, and everybody, because of the global warming, is fighting zombies, but countries cannot cooperate because we are trapped into this kind of power competition. So what is the consequences for the future kind of visions of, environment and energy transition?
That's a very big set of questions that you're asking, but it's a very great set of questions too. So I think for Indonesia, there's a lot to gain from the energy transition, partially because now the solar, electric vehicles, electric two-wheelers, they're cost effective. It's not that you have to subsidize them. They're often cost effective. And for Indonesia, it can solve a number of problems, especially here in Jakarta, of course, with the air pollution. I already see the electric buses going by. There's a lot going on already in changes. And I think those are going to be very beneficial for Indonesia if the country follows up on that. In terms of opportunity, there are some things that probably are not going to be produced in Indonesia and you can't benefit from. Like solar panels. I don't think you're going to produce solar panels as cheaply as China. But batteries and electric vehicles you do have. And there are a lot of policies in place, like you mentioned already, like the export ban on raw nickel and other sort of supply chain policies to try and move up the value chain. I think where Indonesia has struggled so far is really, so now you have a lot of nickel processing in Indonesia, but how do you attract more high-tech manufacturing as well, right? So how do you go to that next phase? And one of the issues is indeed, sort of, from what I understand, is that the electric vehicles are just for the domestic market. They're not for export. Maybe Europe is not the most logical market. Maybe Australia or like other sort of nearby places. And that would be an obvious next step. But I think for Indonesia, there are real opportunities there. And I know I've met a few entrepreneurs here who are working in this area. They're working with ride shares and trying to sort of electrify ride shares with battery exchanges. There's a lot of innovation, I think, in Indonesia happening right now in this sector that can be really beneficial. My other thing that I've just briefly on international institutions, so I'm a scholar of international institutions, but these days I don't look at them very much anymore. I don't think you're going to see major breakthroughs there in the next 5 to 10 years. I'm not projecting further out, but even in Europe, the enthusiasm for major new initiatives like climate financing and so on are really down. And I think the process will keep going. The Paris process will stay alive. But the biggest changes we're going to see because of changes in economics and technological innovation and the sort of the domestic political economy changes. That's really where a lot of the action is right now in the energy transition. And it's not at the level of, it's important that the process keeps going, that we have the COP meetings every year, that countries keep affirming their commitment to climate change. So I think that process is very important, but more in a kind of symbolic way than in a way of actually creating a lot of material support for, say, the just energy transition and so on, which is hopelessly underfinanced. And another thing we're going to do on Sunday is we're going to look at the Jakarta and the flooding issues and all the adaptation issues here in Indonesia, which I know there's a lot of challenges. So I don't think people here have to be persuaded that climate change is a real problem. But I wouldn't count on sort of the global initiatives coming to the rescue anytime soon.
Thank you, Professor. And I would like to open the floor for question and answers. I believe we can collect some 2 or 3 questions from the floor. One from the gentleman over there. One is from our researcher, Wafa. And from this side, yes, please. Starting with this gentleman with batik in the middle.
Okay, good, I don't know, morning or afternoon. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. My name is Ali Akbar. I'm from World Order Lab for MENA Desk. So actually, maybe a little bit expand from your our discussion as you present. I would like ask the simple question about the issue currently that UAE left the OPEC and OPEC Plus. So I wanna see your view about that and the implication in Southeast Asia. Maybe you can put Indonesia there, because I think it's very shock from UAE move, because UAE and Saudi and Gulf dynamics currently is very chaotic, maybe as we can say that. So I need your view about that. That's my simple question for me. I hope you understand. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's not a simple question at all. It's a very complicated one. I appreciate it. And I should also say, for me, it's in the middle of the night because I just arrived from the US. So if I seem, I'll blame the jet lag if I'm not fully coherent. So the UAE leaving OPEC, I think for energy analysts, this was not a surprise. The UAE had been toying with that idea for a while, partially because they were frustrated with production limits. Some people think they chose this particular moment because it would least affect oil markets, because the oil markets are already under strain, and they chose this moment for that particular reason. It does signify a bigger rift between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. The UAE and Saudi Arabia had been very close, and they have been involved in conflict in Yemen, and it's a more fractious relationship right now than it has been for a long time. I also know the UAE has close ties with Indonesia. We actually, I'm from Georgetown, we brought a group of executive students, so mid-level executives from the UAE here 2 weeks ago, I think. And they're very strong. They're very strong in investment ties between the two countries. The UAE is actually also interested in investing in green technology here in Indonesia, so they have a lot of interest there too. I think the UAE is a really interesting example of a country which is very dependent on the sale of fossil fuels, but that is at the same time investing in green technology as well, sort of unlike in the United States. Although there are areas of the United States where that's also happening, like in Texas, for example, but it's becoming politically harder. I don't know how much leaving OPEC really matters. It's not so clear that OPEC was that important anymore in terms of setting market prices. I mean, at least that's the consensus among a lot of energy people, that OPEC's influence was not that strong. But symbolically, it's important, of course.
Wafa?
Thank you, Erik, for your presentation. It was really enlightening for us. My name is Wafa Karisma from CSIS Indonesia, researcher in the Department of International Relations. Got two quick questions. One, from your current observation, do you foresee where the next sort of shale revolution will come from? Either the production side or perhaps the demand side? Is it, because we're all looking at AI boom, quantum computing, other big ambitions that may change the equation, change the lock-ins, push towards a bit further toward realignments. That's my first one. My second one is more personal to Indonesia. Indonesia, you'll get punished for not being green enough by Europe. You'll get punished for getting refinement and manufacturing capacities from China. You'll get punished for getting petrol from Russia. But lock-ins with the US also subject us for potential hurt, erosion of sovereignty, and inability to challenge illiberal Western positions. So where do you see, are we, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, are we further condemned to lock-ins? Or where do you see the pathways for our strategic autonomy from the geopolitical standpoint? Are you seeing it from, this type of things that you mentioned with UAE, with fellow same size powers? Is that where we're going for strategic autonomy? Your take on this? Thank you.
Please.
Yeah, again, these are very big questions. So on the first one, where the next big breakthrough is going to, not a lot of people saw the shale revolution coming. Like, people saw it coming, but not the size of it. If I were able to project accurately where the next big revolution is coming from, I'd probably be very, very wealthy, and I'd probably not be in academia. But I don't know really if anyone knows. Right? We've been talking forever about quantum, about fusion. I do think, so there is the possibility of what people in the oil world or in the energy world call demand destruction for oil right now because of the current crisis. That's what happened in the 1970s with oil. So you had a series of crises that didn't have an immediate effect on sort of what the demand for oil was, but over time really shaped energy efficiency standards, what oil was used for. For example, oil is no longer used for electricity. And so we haven't seen that yet because I think it's going to take some time, but the combination of what happened in 2022 and what's happening now will lead to some changes on the demand side. What kind of technological changes there are on the supply side, I don't know. I mean, sort of nuclear, everybody always talks about it, like a new sort of modular nuclear facilities. It takes really long time to develop. We haven't seen that yet. But again, I'm not good in sort of predicting that, and if I were, I'd probably be in a different business. On the second side, so there is opportunity, of course, for collaboration among middle powers. This is what Carney, of course, said. Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister in Davos, but also the UAE and other countries are thinking about this, not just as collaboration between between a broader array of middle powers. My view is that we're living in a world right now which is just it's a very sort of on-demand kind of global order where most countries are going to form relationships and ties on very functional, pragmatic bases rather than trying to choose sides. And that's what Indonesia, I think, is doing. Indonesia, of course, in an economic sense, is becoming more and more related to China. But they're also very, they would like to have stronger ties with the US. There seem to be some breakthroughs. I think on the US side, there hasn't been a whole lot of attention for Indonesia and other countries in Southeast Asia in the last, over for a while, actually. But the government is trying to, I think, restore that. And they would love to have stronger ties with Europe as well as with the Middle East and the UAE. I don't think it's choosing one side over the other. My view is that most countries in the position that Indonesia are in are trying hard to avoid having to choose sides. The question is whether that will remain possible or whether the conflict between China and the US will become so heated that, like in the Cold War, countries were almost forced to choose sides. But I don't think we're in that world right now. And I think that most countries are still best off sort of getting to their strategic autonomy by picking relationships on more so with the security side, the US is still very important for Indonesia. On the economic side, there are different kinds of actors. That seems like the most sensible strategy for me, rather than a full-on realignment.
Thank you. The gentleman over there.
Hi, Professor Voeten. Thank you for the presentation, very enlightening. I'm Faris from Industrial Policy Lab, Indonesia. And I guess I have a remark and a question. So first remark is on what you said earlier regarding how, well, obviously, all around the world, energy trade is becoming more politicized, and this has become a big challenge for developing countries as well. What I've noticed, at least in Indonesia, at least for certain types of products like solar PV and batteries, we've mostly been a beneficiary of that politicization in actuality. So even for solar PV, because of the trade war between the US and China, there is a lot of incoming investments for solar PV manufacturing in Batam in particular for exporting towards the United States. So as a result, we've seen exports jumping up from just around 500 million a year back in 2023, and now it's now around 5 billion. Sorry, no, $3 billion US dollars in total, both in solar cell and solar modules. So that's the extent of how much we've benefited from it. So I guess what I would add as well is that this can actually be an opportunity for developing countries. And the next thing I would like to say is that I have this question with regards to what Indonesia is doing right now. So geopolitically, we understand that, well, everything is becoming politicized. You can't separate economics from politics anymore. And unfortunately for developing countries, the only leverage that we have, since we don't have the technology, since we don't have the financing, since we don't have the, obviously the political power that becomes the basis for geopolitical leverage, the only leverage that we have is natural resources. And in the case of Indonesia, we've decided to leverage those to further increase our leverage in natural resources by resorting to things like export bans. And recently the government has come up with a plan for centralizing all exports into one body, so that this body has substantial leverage and pricing power over the global market. My question is this something that's ill-advised, or is this something that's rational for a middle power that only has leverage in terms of natural resources? To some extent, it has succeeded, at least according to some metrics in nickel, for example. But of course, this is a risky strategy. You don't know what this would actually lead to. So that would be my question. Thank you.
Please.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's a great question. I actually am hoping to learn, so I just landed in Indonesia, so I'm hoping to learn more exactly what the latest move actually means from, so I'll be speaking to some people about that over the next few days. So the export ban on nickel, I think, can work because Indonesia has such a dominant global position on the nickel markets. So you can do it, and you've attracted a lot of processing in nickel. From what I understand, and again, I'm not an expert, but I've read some reports on this, is that the problem really has been that refining itself is not such a hugely economically beneficial activity, right? It's mostly done by Chinese refining companies. Employment is relatively small. These plants are refining, it's more expensive than doing it in China. And then there's environmental cost to refining as well. So the real benefits come if you can use the processed minerals for higher level manufacturing as well. And that's really where I think the biggest gains for Indonesia would come from. And so you mentioned developing countries benefiting from the geopolitical conflict between China and the US because now most firms want to locate production outside of China, right? But the main beneficiaries have been Vietnam and India. And it's been a little bit harder. For example, I know Apple has been struggling to build sort of facilities here in Indonesia. I don't want to judge policies in Indonesia because I know too little about the details of the policies and the industries. But I think sort of the policy design really, really matters. So the details are really important. So I think with the nickel, it can work because you have a dominant position globally. Clearly, you want to be more than just an exporter of resources, because we all know from decades of research that you don't become rich from just exporting raw materials. You become wealthy if you move up the value chain. So I think well-designed industrial policies that try to achieve that can certainly help. But policy design is really important, and the reason why I'm not judging the policies is because I don't fully understand, especially the latest move to centralize the purchasing, and I'm hoping to learn more about that over the next week or so.
Thank you. Before another question from the floor, I have two questions from online. First is from Melbourne Croissant, whoever he or she is. The question is, it seems that the rush to politicize the energy trade has so far invigorated state capitalism among developing countries. And how does that impact transnational non-state market actors, like, for example, multinational corporations? And to add to the above question posed by Hugh Sasongko Jati, would it affect their incentives in business strategy? For example, as such that they follow the state alignment between the US, China, according to their trade patterns. Have you get the question?
The last question I didn't fully get.
Would it affect their incentives in business strategy, the MNCs?
Oh, the MNCs,
yes.
okay.
For example, they follow the state alignment between the US and China according to their trade partners.
Yeah, thanks. So I definitely think there is, so again, I mentioned, so the energy trade, I think is part of a broader phenomenon in the world, where the role of politics and the role of the state in economic affairs is increasing in the United States, in Europe, and also around the world, right? We're seeing a shift in the kind of capitalism that we're seeing, and I think energy is contributing to that. Now, so there is a growing study now in a field called geoeconomics, which has become sort of a burgeoning field in economics, where people specifically analyze sort of how MNCs are changing their investment patterns and their location decisions based on the changing geopolitical environment. And people are finding quite strong evidence that there is strong, what people call friendshoring. So friendshoring is basically companies locating to countries that have more stable relations with the markets where you want to sell, right? So US companies locating in places that they think are not going to get in trouble with the US. And then, so there's clear evidence that this is happening, and this is happening partially in response to policies. It is also, but I'm not sure how much energy plays a role in that, to be honest. I think that's more sort of a broader phenomenon in the change in geopolitical relationships between the US and China. This is, of course, where for a country like Indonesia, having sort of strong bilateral relations with the US could be beneficial. But of course, for firms, if we're thinking about location decisions and production locations, they're also thinking about investments that are going to be 10 or 20 years down the road. So they have to be assured that that environment is going to be sort of stable for a longer period of time. But it's clear that firms are changing investment decisions based on geopolitics.
Thank you. I saw a hand over there. Yeah, please.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the lecture. I actually just have 3 questions,
Can you
short
mention
questions.
your name and
Yes, I'm Rajeshwari. So my first question will be, in your recent work on the fragmentation of global energy markets, you have suggested that geopolitical alignment increasingly outweighs efficiency considerations. So do you think middle powers like Indonesia, they can continue strategic hedging? Or will they eventually face stronger pressures to align with the competing blocs? Also, my second question will be, now the CBAM, as the EU expands the CBAM and the US increases their green subsidies, how can developing countries, such as Indonesia, for example, they protect their energy-intensive and trade-exposed industries from being economically marginalized by those West climate trade architecture? And the last question would be, if the Western green subsidies and the environmental standards effectively lock the developing nations out of their green technology supply chain, should the emerging markets like Indonesia pivot towards building alternative South-South trade architectures for critical minerals such as nickel and renewable tech? Thank you.
So again, like everyone is asking very big questions that I'll do my best to give some answers to. So the first question about forcing to choose sides, I don't think that countries like Indonesia have to choose sides, at least in the medium to short term. And so I don't think this is, so a lot of people are thinking about, is this a new Cold War that's emerging between China and the US? And one big difference is that China still doesn't have global power projection on security. China only has one formal military ally, which is North Korea. China has about 4 to 5% of global arms exports. And so there is a realization for many countries that China does not yet provide sort of a full-fledged alternative to the US. Now that could change, right? We're seeing technological changes, and China is becoming more important in arms exports and the kind of things it's exporting. We're also not seeing the same kind of ideological struggle that we saw in the Cold War. So my view is that at least in the short to medium term, 5 to 15 years, but I really don't like to talk about further down because I think it's hard to project. I don't think I think countries can play both sides and can have multiple relationships. On CBAM, so CBAM is the EU has restricted, so raised sort of essential sort of import tariffs for energy-intensive industries like aluminum, steel, cement, and so on. Because within the EU, there are these costs for carbon, there's emissions trading, and then they want to protect sort of European producers from foreign producers, which especially affects high energy intensity exporters. And that includes Indonesia, although I don't think Indonesia is the worst affected country there. But it's a part of a broader pattern of these kind of competitiveness concerns that exist in the EU and other Western countries about green technology, that yes, we want to decarbonize, but we're really concerned about our own companies' abilities to do so. And so there's other kinds of barriers erected as well. And I do think this is problematic for a whole host of reasons, and it speaks to that earlier question too that you were asking about, how can you change from having a Hyundai facility that produces for the Indonesian market to where you're actually becoming a country that becomes that produces for exports, right? Because that's a good degree for growth. And I think in vehicles that's hard because the EU has a very developed automobile industry that's extremely powerful, and they're going to be protectionist. And the same is true in the United States. So in that sense, focusing on other growing markets would be useful. But there, of course, you have to compete with China, right? Because there's even a stronger incentive in the EU and so on to keep out Chinese products. So I don't know what a good answer to that is. I mean, you need to find your niche. I mean, outcompeting China is hard, and entering really heavily protected markets is difficult as well. So maybe it's a stepwise thing, right? Where, as I suggested before, you first focus on maybe becoming a country that can export to like Australia or so on, which may be more receptive to this because they don't have a strong domestic automobile industry, and they might be more receptive. And they also have concerns about China. So that might be another first step. And sorry, and now I'm blanking on the third question. That was
the South-South potential of South-South cooperation, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of linked to this. I mean, I think South-South cooperation is important, and this is again why I believe we live in this world, which is some people call it the a la carte world, right? Where so I know Indonesia has been flirting with the BRICS affiliations, and what is BRICS? It's just a group of countries that are sort of middle powers, or some larger powers as well.
Not revisionist.
Yeah, they're revisionist in some ways, but they don't have that much in common, right? They're not it's not strongly ideologically tied, and none of these countries, or most of these countries, are not choosing side between China and the United States. So India very strongly keeps playing both sides. Russia is forced into one side. South Africa wants to certainly not choose. Brazil wants to obviously keep trading with both sides. And I think Indonesia fits that group really well. Now, there are, of course, still premiums to getting access to the US and Europe. I mean, it's even true for Chinese manufacturers because the markup on cars in like Europe and the US is much higher than, for example, than it is elsewhere. But there are also, in those groups of states, we already mentioned the Gulf states like UAE or so on, like very economically powerful countries as well. So why not explore those ties, right? I honestly don't think we live in a world where you have to say we're either going to do this or that. We live in a world where you're actually able to do both, to do ties with the Middle East, ties with China, ties with India, ties with the US. So fully exploring that menu of options seems like the most sensible strategy to me.
Is there any question from the floor? Yes. You want to ask a question? Yes, please. one more question from the floor.
Hello, hello, Professor Erik. My name is Nadi. I'm from the Research and Policy Advocacy Team from Indonesia Youth Coalition for Climate Action. My name is Nadi. And first of all, I want to confirm that you mentioned that strategic autonomy requires middle power to maintain a balanced approach toward major powers. So the question is, in the context of rising tensions in South China Sea, like how can we see the ASEAN states situation right now, such as the Vietnams and Philippines, how can they balance their economic, diplomatic, security, and energy interests, given that maritime dispute and geopolitical tension can disrupt trade routes, energy flows, and broader supply chain? Can strategies such as hedging and diversification remain sustainable in the long term? And if not, do you have any proposal or framework to propose? Thank you.
Thanks again, a really, really big question, and I'm not an expert on the South China Sea. Of course, everything will change if there is an active military conflict involving China. But we have to say that China has not, so there have been some skirmishes with India, but China has not had a major military conflict in the region since Vietnam, and that's well over 40 years ago. That could, of course, change. But so far, I think a lot of these countries have been quite successful in navigating these tensions. So you're seeing flare-ups of more hostile conflicts, you're seeing temporary embargoes, you're seeing incidents, especially with the Philippines and Chinese Navy, but you're also seeing restraint. And you're also seeing continued economic interactions, continued diplomatic interactions. And I think there's a good reason for this, right? But this is also a good reason why all of these countries want to also remain ties with the United States, because like the Philippines or Vietnam as well, because they know that too much dependence on China might risk other forms of independence and might risk their position in these types of disputes. I don't see these disputes ending anytime soon. I think they also serve domestic political purposes, both in China and in Southeast Asian countries. But I don't immediately see a reason why they would have to escalate to a level that would make trade impossible with China, or that would make economic relations impossible there, or vice versa with the United States. So my sense is more of a continuation of this kind of low-level hostilities that sometimes flare up and become very serious, but there's also, I think, good reasons why it hasn't escalated to a different level yet.
Professor, in my understanding, the potentials of misunderstanding between China and the US, at least in this region, is coming from the fact that from the military technical perspective, there have been some kind of rise of anti-access area denial capabilities, which I believe that China is actually rising. Yes, China cannot compete the US as a military power, but China at this point can actually prevent from the US to access the territory. So these create, some kind of unique position in terms of military balance. So we believe sometimes here in the region that the balance is actually quite vulnerable. So we need to maintain the level of understanding, good understanding between US and China, so they don't actually go to another Thucydides war because of risk of misinterpretation. My question is, just as a follow-up to that question, what is actually the potentials of keeping the China policy rational in the US? Does this new energy policy pay off for US domestic political system? Does it create jobs? How the US economy is doing now? And where is actually China factor in this? So we've been talking about China as the sources of global trade imbalances and so on and so forth. Is there any effort or safeguard, at least from the American side, just to keep that level of understanding enough so we don't have another spiral of misunderstanding that can create conflict?
Yeah, again, very, very, very big questions. So first of all, I should say that concern, so I mentioned energy politics being very polarized. Concern about China in the US is not so polarized. There's actually Democrats and Republicans very much agree, and this has been a change over time, right? And the concerns that the US has are partially, well, Taiwan is number one, right? That's a big concern and a big worry that there might actually be a live military conflict over Taiwan. The trade imbalances are very important, and they've been growing. Like, the tariffs have done nothing to deal with the trade imbalances. In fact, China has now a larger export surplus than it ever has before. The concern in the US is that partially that export surplus was received through like heavy subsidies, state-owned enterprises, and so violations of trade rules, and that is a concern. So that's the number two concern that the Americans have. And the third concern is about authoritarianism and the spread of authoritarianism. And here also technology is important, because this is the Chinese are exporting technology that facilitates governments from surveilling their citizens, maintaining control. And there's AI can contribute to that as well, but there are other technologies that the Chinese have been exporting a lot, and there is real concern that might actually spread and that might change the nature of regimes, or help sort of more authoritarian-leaning regimes stay in power. And in terms of the military exports, the picture changes when you're thinking about security exports more generally. So if you're thinking about security exports for like internal security, then China has become a very dominant player recently. So in terms of misinterpretation, I don't know. I mean, it's important to keep diplomatic channels alive, obviously, and they are alive. I mean, there are good bilateral relations. There is also an important, so something in academia we call a self-fulfilling prophecy, which if you keep talking about China as the enemy, it will become the enemy, because that's how it works. I think that's very dangerous. I think you have to maintain rational and measured. There are many areas of potential cooperation between the US and China, and it's important to see what those areas are and to build on those areas of cooperation. And in my view, green energy is one of them. So I think, as I mentioned, I think US energy policy is completely irrational at the moment, and dangerously so. But yeah, U.S. politics is not at its most rational state right now, so I think there's good reason to worry.
Also the reason why I'm asking. And thank you very much, Professor Erik Voeten. And I think we have come to the end of our discussion, and I would invite the floor to give the round of applause for our professor.
Thank you so much for the great questions. Those were. I'm sure I answered most of them, only 10% or so, but I really appreciate them.
Thank you so much, Professor. I give back to you, Nadia.
Thank you so much, Professor Erik Voeten, and also Mas Andrew, for moderating this discussion today. Before I ask you to come down the stage, I'd like to invite Bapak Yose Rizal Damuri to give this token of appreciation to Professor Erik Voeten, and we will also have a picture on the stage. Thank you once again, for Professor Erik Voeten for a very fascinating and deeply analytical lecture, and also Mas Andrew Mantong for expertly moderating this morning's rich discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the DFD Lab lecture on Great Power Competition and the Politicization of Energy Trade. Our sincere thanks go to our keynote speaker for today, Bapak Awidya Santikajaya, our distinguished lecturer, and to all of our audiences here with us in the auditorium today. Thank you for joining us in the CSIS auditorium. I am Nadia Daulay, and I look forward to seeing you at the next CSIS event. Thank you very much.